Ever wonder why unusual batting stances have faded from baseball? It used to be common to see players with their hands a foot apart, looking like they might bunt, only to swing away. Many players who once had unique stances now use more conventional ones. This raises the question, who had the weirdest batting stance ever, and why did these stances disappear? Interestingly, some of the quirkiest stances have curious reasons behind them. For instance, John W. Leffis would stand at the very back of the box, keep his feet 3 inches apart, face his entire back toward the pitcher, and then swing. He claimed this unusual stance worked for him. These eccentric stances have largely disappeared as players have shifted to more standardized approaches, possibly because modern techniques emphasize consistency and efficiency over individuality. Each batter's stance is unique, with some being memorable and others quite extraordinary. Take this kid. He starts in a crouch, leaps, clicks his heels, and twirls his bat with one hand. After missing a hittable pitch, he decides to switch it up. He twirls the bat on both sides of his body, then spins it with both hands, and even tosses the bat to himself. As he faces a strike, he adopts a new stance, dropping down again, but this time with double-handed twirls and more drop-downs. He salutes the pitcher to acknowledge being down 2 strikes. Despite his efforts, fouling off tough pitches and jumping around, he eventually grounds out. While baseball rules don't prohibit such antics, the tournament director warned the team about the excessive showmanship. In this case, the unconventional approach didn't lead to success, and it highlighted the need for balance between flair and effectiveness in the game. It was deemed dangerous, leading to a ban on the stance with the quote, "We cannot accept this." However, as long as both feet remain in the box, players can generally adopt any stance they prefer. Historically, batting stances were less crucial than commonly thought. For decades, the prevailing belief was that the stance was merely a starting position, with swing mechanics being the real focus. Players studied and refined their swing mechanics obsessively, while the stance was largely a matter of personal preference to aid timing and comfort. Consider the difference between David Ortiz's straightforward stance and Kevin Youkilis's unconventional one. Youkilis would bring his knees together, hold his bat overhead, point it toward the pitcher, and keep his hands a foot apart on the bat. Despite its oddity, this stance helped Youkilis become one of the league's top hitters. Ultimately, while stances can vary widely, the core focus remains on effective swing mechanics. Compared to Ortiz, the swing itself is often quite similar despite the bizarre stances. Many unconventional stances are essentially psychological tricks batters use to prepare themselves. For example, one player would stretch his front foot almost out of the batter's box and his back foot as far back as possible. He adopted this routine after consulting a sports psychologist who stressed the importance of a repeatable routine. Although the stance looked unusual, the swing remained quite standard. For others, a stance is more about pre-pitch ritual than the swing itself, and some are stranger than others. Aaron Rowand, for instance, had a pre-pitch routine called the drunk, where he would wave his bat below his belt in a groin area motion. Despite the mocking from fans, this odd ritual helped him focus, and no coach or player ever suggested he stop. Jeff Bagwell, however, wasn't as fortunate. His distinctive stance drew mixed reactions, highlighting how personal rituals can become integral to a player's performance and identity. The Hall of Famer Jeff Bagwell was once traded because his team deemed his batting stance too flawed. ESPN even called it the worst trade of all time. Bagwell was known for his low crouch stance, which looked uncomfortable, and he himself admitted it was extremely stupid. The Red Sox were convinced his stance would hinder his power hitting at Fenway Park and predicted a short career for him because of it. Despite these concerns, Bagwell excelled in the minors and quickly became a top prospect. Seeing an opportunity, the Red Sox traded him in 1990 for 37-year-old reliever Larry Anderson. Although Anderson pitched well, he only lasted half a season with the Red Sox. Meanwhile, Bagwell joined the Astros, who also disapproved of his stance. Despite the pressure to change it, Bagwell continued hitting well from the start. His success with the Astros proved the Red Sox's assessment wrong and highlighted how significant this trade became in baseball history. A few coaches defended Jeff Bagwell's unconventional stance and wanted him to keep it, and they won the argument when Bagwell went on to win Rookie of the Year. His stance, which had initially led to his trade, only became more idiosyncratic over time. Bagwell's unique approach contributed to his impressive career. He was a four-time All-Star, a three-time Silver Slugger, hit nearly 450 home runs, and was inducted into the Hall of Fame. The Red Sox's decision to trade him for just half a season of Larry Anderson became one of baseball's most notorious blunders. To rob him of the hit. Yes, Brooks was playing for the Mets that day. In fact, it was his third spring training as a passionate baseball fan, having persuaded teams to let him play in actual games, take real at-bats, and be treated like a genuine player, all while raising money for charity. At that point, Brooks had a .045 MLB batting average, meaning he was a more productive hitter than Craig Counsell at that time. The day after Brooks robbed him, the Dodgers released Counsell. Desperate to save his career, Counsell began experimenting with his stance. He was picked up by the Diamondbacks and adopted a new approach that marked the beginning of a turnaround in his career. Interestingly, at least one player in Japan continues this strategic approach. He spreads his hands about a foot apart and sometimes holds the bat with just one hand before quickly adjusting his grip as the pitch approaches. One Japanese player spreads his hands about a foot apart and sometimes holds the bat with just one hand before adjusting his grip to slap hit pitches. This technique was more common in Ty Cobb's era when players focused on contact hitting. As time progressed, Babe Ruth revolutionized the game by standing tall with his feet close together and swinging for the fences. His approach, swinging hard, striking out often, and hitting many home runs, set a new standard. Soon, everyone was aiming for power, leading to stances like Mel Ott's, who had an exaggerated leg kick to maximize his swing. Ott, standing at 5 feet 9 inches and weighing 170 pounds, hit 511 home runs. Later, Tony Bautista adopted a similar power-hitting strategy. Tony Bautista's batting stance was distinctive. He would turn his entire torso toward the pitcher, stretch his hands back as far as possible, and swing with all his might. According to Bautista, he developed this stance after trying it in Venezuela, getting a hit, and deciding to stick with it. He aimed to generate. In contrast, another player's stance proved to be a hindrance. Initially, he batted normally and was a league-average hitter. However, after being traded, he endured the worst season of his career, ranking as the fourth least productive hitter in baseball. His struggles continued into spring training, where he went an astonishing 0-4-44 to start the season. He eventually admitted that a famous country singer had pressured him into changing his stance. Suddenly, his career was in serious jeopardy. According to him, he ended a dreadful streak by smacking a ball into the outfield. He put his head down, sprinted to first base, and felt a massive weight lift off his shoulders. But when he looked up, he saw that country superstar Garth Brooks had made a diving catch. The next season, Craig Counsell started standing up straighter, which helped the Diamondbacks win a World Series. As his stance evolved further, it became even more unusual. By 2004, when he joined the Brewers, his stance had become one of the strangest in baseball history. Despite its oddity, Counsell's unconventional stance revived his career, allowing him to play 16 seasons in the major leagues, an impressive feat largely attributed to Garth Brooks' memorable catch. Today, such stances are rare in baseball. Counsell's only public explanation for his unusual stance was that it simply felt right and helped him perform better, so he continued using it. Historically, batting stances often involved more strategic elements. For example, Ty Cobb would keep his hands several inches apart on the bat while the pitch was delivered. Depending on the pitch, he would either slide his bottom hand up to choke up for a contact swing or slide his top hand down for more power. This adjustment was made on the fly as the pitcher threw the ball. Maximum torque and power, and his physical attributes, standing 6 feet 2 inches and weighing 230 pounds, made him an imposing figure at the plate. This was evident in a memorable clip where a pitcher hit him, and Bautista's advance toward first base scared the pitcher so much that he ran into the outfield. Bautista's sheer presence and aggressive stance contributed to his success. In the decades following, baseball saw a shift back towards contact hitting. Speculation suggests that the introduction of turf may have influenced this change. The artificial grass made ground balls travel faster, making them more effective and valuable. Consequently, players like Mike Fishland adapted their stances to ensure better contact. Fishland, along with others in the 1970s and 80s, would bend down as much as possible, placing their hands near their ankles to reduce strike zone size and improve their chances of making contact, even if it meant sacrificing power. The strike zone is defined by the batter's stance when preparing to swing, according to official MLB rules. This means that a 6 feet 7 inches player could theoretically have the same strike zone as a 4 feet 0 inches player if he crouched low enough. A young player figured this out and decided to exploit the rule. He went to the plate using only one hand on the bat, crouching deeply to minimize his strike zone. Although he took a ball, it was called a strike because the rule stipulates that the strike zone is determined by the batter's natural stance. Since this player didn't use this stance consistently, his strike zone remained the same as if he were standing upright. Despite this, Yasiel Puig attempted a similar approach in a real MLB game after a clip of the kid's tactic went viral. Puig didn't fully commit to the stance, and since it wasn't his regular stance, his strike zone didn't change, and he took a called strike. Interestingly, many players have used stance adjustments to their advantage. Rickey Henderson, for instance, adopted a stance designed to minimize his strike zone, helping him draw more walks. This strategy contributed to his MLB record of 1,406 stolen bases and his ability to hit nearly 300 home runs. His stance was specifically intended to make his strike zone as small as possible, enabling him to get on base and steal bases effectively. Bizarrely, this approach even inspired one of the greatest batting stances of all time. Gary Sheffield's stance was unconventional and aggressive, characterized by a rapid bat waggle that created one of the most distinctive and powerful swings in baseball history. Despite its violent appearance, Sheffield's stance helped him hit over 500 home runs. The evolution of batting stances highlights how players continually adapt their techniques to gain an edge, whether through power, contact, or psychological strategy. Gary Sheffield's distinctive batting stance was partly inspired by Rickey Henderson, despite their stances looking nothing alike. Sheffield admired Henderson's confidence and flair, Henderson's bat flips, celebrations, and charismatic presence on the field. Sheffield wanted to develop his own unique style, so he created a stance he thought looked cool. He tested it in batting practice and hit 10 home runs in one round, deciding to stick with it. When someone criticized his stance for being unorthodox, Sheffield agreed, embracing the fact that it didn't conform to traditional MLB expectations. Sheffield worked tirelessly on his swing mechanics to achieve the power and consistency necessary for success. However, the stance and bat wiggle were initially more about aesthetics and personal expression. During Sheffield's career, baseball was in a golden age of quirky stances. Players like Tony Bautista, Kevin Youkilis, and Jeff Bagwell thrived with unconventional stances, making a mark in the game despite, or perhaps because of, their odd approaches. Cal Ripken Jr., one of the league's top players, was known for his ever-changing stances. In 1989, he began the season with one stance, only to switch by the year's end. In 1991, he introduced a bounce, then changed again the following season. By 1995, he adjusted his hands for a more relaxed grip, and in 1996, he developed the notorious violin stance, where he would slide his bat back and forth on his shoulder while waiting for the pitch. Ripken continued to modify his stance throughout his career, demonstrating how personal preferences and adjustments influenced batting techniques. Ichiro Suzuki's entry into MLB with his Japanese-style hitting, known as the pendulum swing, was initially met with skepticism. This style involved swinging his leg across the plate for timing and balance. Many doubted his ability to adapt to MLB's higher pitching velocities. Despite the controversy, Ichiro's coaches allowed him to use his technique, which proved successful. He became one of the league's top hitters, showcasing the effectiveness of his unique approach. Shohei Ohtani, another player who brought a distinctive style from Japan, initially used a leg kick in his swing. However, during his first spring training in America, he switched to a more conservative toe tap. This adjustment led to immediate improvement in his performance, and he has maintained this modified approach since then. Connor Joe is another example of a player who started with an unusual stance. Similar to Tony Bautista's approach, Joe's stance lasted only 8 games before he transitioned to a more conventional method. Zach Neto also experienced a change in his stance. He started his rookie season with a pronounced leg kick but later eliminated it. Historically, batting stances were about adjusting to how a player felt. If someone struggled, they'd tweak their stance based on their instincts. For instance, Cal Ripken Jr. faced struggles in 1996 without the benefit of advanced metrics or detailed swing analysis. He didn't have access to a plethora of camera angles or data tracking his swing's length. Instead, Ripken noticed he was having difficulty with off-speed pitches and hypothesized that a more relaxed stance might help. By holding his bat like a violin to stay more composed, he improved his performance and continued with this adjustment, leading to multiple changes in his stance throughout his career. Similarly, players like Tony Bautista, Craig Counsell, and John Wadham adopted distinctive stances based on their own methods and experimentation. Their unconventional approaches were often driven by personal preference and trial and error rather than systematic analysis. Today, the approach to hitting has evolved significantly. Players now have access to sophisticated technology and data analytics. Hitting labs break down every aspect of a swing, analyze video, and target specific inefficiencies. This high-tech scrutiny often leads to players adopting similar stances, such as standing close to the plate, slightly open, with hands held high. This standardization is driven by the need to reduce extra movements and keep up with increasingly faster fastballs. Bryce Harper, as a prospect, used a distinctive front leg movement that worked well for him. However, as he began facing pitchers with velocities exceeding 95 miles per hour regularly, he simplified his stance to adapt to the higher speeds. This kind of adjustment is common among MLB players, who continuously refine their stances to optimize performance. The evolution of batting stances reflects broader trends in baseball. While some players have adapted and refined their stances for greater effectiveness, others have shifted to more conventional approaches over time. The history of these stances illustrates how personal preference, strategic adjustments, and evolving game standards shape the way players prepare to hit. Phil Plantier, known for his extremely exaggerated squat, hit 34 home runs in 1993 despite his unconventional stance. Remarkably, Plantier had used this stance his entire life but only became aware of its peculiarity when he saw himself on national television for the first time. In contrast to today's players, who are filmed and analyzed from Little League onward, Plantier's approach was based on personal feel and timing rather than data. Traditionalists argue that such adjustments can be detrimental, suggesting that moving away from a player's natural stance can lead to discomfort and poorer performance. Yet, in a high-pressure environment where players face the risk of being demoted or cut, adhering to what feels natural might not always be feasible if it's not producing results. While players once expressed individuality through unique batting stances, today's players often showcase their personality through flamboyant haircuts, flashy equipment, and signature bat flips. Batting stances have become more standardized, reflecting a shift from personal expression to optimizing performance through technological analysis and uniform strategies. Nevertheless, the evolution of batting stances highlights the ongoing balance between tradition and innovation in baseball. Strange batting stances may be rare today, but some players still embrace unique approaches. Luis Campusano, for instance, uses an exaggerated leg kick reminiscent of Tony Bautista. Even more intriguingly, Gary Sheffield's son, Noah Sheffield, a highly touted prospect committed to Florida State, employs a stance nearly identical to his father's. If Noah Sheffield reaches the major leagues, it remains to be seen whether coaches will encourage him to conform to current norms or if he'll revive the era of distinctive stances from the 90s and early 2000s. Only time will tell if this nostalgic style will make a comeback.